I hadn't seen my older brother Alan in a couple of years, but I knew that he'd changed a lot. We used to be really close, but ever since he moved to Nebraska, he started to pull away from me. He got pretty religious, and whenever we'd talk on the phone, he always added judgmental comments about my lifestyle. I'd been happily divorced since 2022. My ex-husband was a total loser, and I'm so much better off without him. But Alan did not approve. He'd never been married, so he didn't understand how a marriage like mine could just fall apart. I hated how he lectured me about that kind of stuff. So over time, I just stopped answering his calls. Last month, he called me out of the blue to invite me over. He said that he missed me, and he didn't understand how we drifted so far apart. But he didn't apologize for all the times that he offended me. I really wanted to see him again, and although that if we had an actual face-to-face conversation, maybe we'd actually hash things out. So I agreed to go. I flew to Nebraska, and he picked me up at the airport. I stayed at his house for a day before he started lecturing me again. Having that conversation in person only made things worse. I stormed off and checked into a nearby hotel. I went online and changed my plane ticket to leave in the morning. I was so angry that I traveled all this way for nothing. I sat by myself in the hotel room, waiting for Alan to call and apologize. Of course he didn't. To help calm me down, I went to a hotel jacuzzi. I saw one of the other guests, a pretty blonde named Jane. Right away, she seemed really friendly. She said she was a long-term resident of the hotel. She didn't tell me she was a but I figured that she was. I was a pretty hardcore feminist, so I had nothing against her line of work. If she was happy with her life, who was I to judge? We stayed in the jacuzzi for about an hour. I told her about my problems with my brother, and she assured me that he'd come around. She told me about how her family had disowned her before they eventually reconnected, and that gave me hope. Just when I was about to go back to my room, I heard a buzzing noise from my purse. Someone was trying to call me. I got out of the jacuzzi and saw that it was Alan. I answered the call, but I accidentally left it on speaker so Jane could hear both sides of the conversation. Alan asked me if I'd calmed down enough to go back. He said that he forgave me for overreacting. I felt like screaming at him, but Jane waved at me from the jacuzzi. "Call him Mr. Golden," she whispered to me. I didn't know what she meant, but I did. I called Alan by that nickname, whatever it meant, and then Alan instantly went silent. "What's wrong?" I asked him. He absolutely freaked out, screaming into the phone that I had no idea what I was talking about. Then he hung up on me. Jane smiled and explained that she recognized Alan's voice. He was one of her clients, and he'd used that nickname whenever he saw her. Apparently, he paid for Jane's services dozens of times in the last year. I couldn't stop myself from laughing. My brother was such a hypocrite. I felt so vindicated by exposing him. I thanked Jane for the tip and went back to my room to dry off and watch TV. I guess I fell asleep pretty fast. Eventually, I woke up to a desperate pounding on my hotel door room. A little groggy, I went to the door and looked through the keyhole. I didn't see anyone on the other side. A little scared, I opened the door and looked outside. The corridor was empty. I told myself that I probably just dreamt the noise. But then I noticed a bloody handprint on my door. Chills ran up my spine. Suddenly, I saw some movement around the corner. I slowly walked outside, ready to run back in my room if things got dangerous. That's when I saw my brother standing over Jane's dying body. She had a knife to her stomach. I stood there, frozen. I just caught my brother murdering someone. He turned towards me and said, She swore she'd never tell. My whole body was numb. I felt myself backing away. He just stared at me for a long moment, deciding what he should do next. Then he reached down and pulled the knife. In a rush of movement, he raced towards me with the knife. He was going to murder me too. I was his sister. We were so close. But now it was like he was a completely different person. I ran to my open door, but Alan grabbed me by the arm and pulled me towards him. He held the knife to the side of my neck. "Sinners need to die," he whispered in my ear. I felt the cold edge of the blade pressed into my skin. If I didn't fight back, he'd slit my throat. I elbowed him hard in the stomach, forcing him to loosen his grip on my arm. I raced down the corridor, jumping over Jane's dying body. Alan wasn't too far behind me. He was extremely fast, diving at me with the knife extended. But just as he leaped over Jane's body, she stretched out her hand and grabbed his ankle. Instantly, he toppled forward and landed face first on the concrete. He laid there for a second, not moving. I couldn't see the knife. Suddenly, I reached down and pushed Alan's body to the side. The knife was sticking out of his chest. He had accidentally skewered himself when he fell. His eyes had rolled back to the back of his head. He was dead. I went back to my hotel room and grabbed my phone to call the police. When the ambulance came, they took away the bodies. I went with them to the hospital. Alan was declared dead, but the doctors said that Jane would make a full recovery. We still keep in touch.
Over a month ago, I went to Idaho to meet my boyfriend Robbie's family for the first time. Robbie had grown up in a really small town, though he didn't act like it at all. He acted like all our other city friends, so when he invited me, I assumed his hometown would be a mid-sized city with plenty to do. I was very wrong. The whole town had just a couple thousand people, and it was also spread out with endless flat fields. I always loved traveling, but this was the first place I'd visited that genuinely creeped me out. As we drove through the town's one main road, Robbie excitedly gave me a tour of everything we passed. I couldn't believe it. He was actually excited to be back here. He wasn't embarrassed or anything. We parked in front of his childhood home, and his parents ran out to greet us. They seemed like really nice, warm people. Robbie had already told them a lot about me, so they asked me a bunch of questions about my work and my family. It was very pleasant. After settling in, I realized that I had forgot to bring my allergy medication. I'm extremely allergic to cats, and Robbie's mom, Catherine, had 3 cats. I asked Catherine if she had any medicine I could borrow, but she told me that I'd have to run to the store. That's when I found out that everyone in this town shopped exclusively at Walmart. That's why they called it the store. It was literally the only store in the area. I asked Robbie to go with me, but he was so excited to catch up with his parents. I ended up taking his car and driving myself there. I know it's weird to admit, but even though I was in my late 20s, I'd never actually been in a Walmart before. I always preferred places like Trader Joe's and Whole Foods instead. I thought of Walmart as the kind of place that poor people went to. But I was pleasantly surprised when I entered. It was a modern, clean building with pretty much everything a person would need. The old woman who greeted me seemed really nice, and the cashiers and customers all smiled when they saw me. I guess they didn't see a lot of new faces. I went to the pharmacy section and got the medicine I needed. Then I got some wine to bring back to Robbie's parents. As I was checking out, the cashier engaged in a bit of small talk. She asked about what brought me to Idaho. I told them I was meeting my in-laws for the first time. She smiled, welcoming me to the area. Then I mentioned Robbie's name, and the woman's expression instantly hardened. "You're staying with the Carpenters?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Catherine and Bob Carpenter. I'm dating their son." The woman looked around the room, making sure that no one heard me. Then she printed out my receipt and wrote something on it before she placed it in one of my bags. I thanked her and left. When I got back in the car, I pulled out my receipt to see what she'd written. It was a single sentence at the bottom of the paper. "They're in a cult." As I drove back to Robbie's house, I had no idea what to do. Was this some kind of small town joke that locals played on outsiders? Or was she serious? I didn't know my in-laws well enough to ask them, but I trusted Robbie enough to talk to him about it. I parked my car and walked inside with my medicine and wine. Catherine greeted me at the door, saying that I was just in time for brunch. Robbie and his dad were already sitting at the table. They looked up and smiled at me. With the notes still on my mind, I started to see the house in a new light. The walls were covered with family photos, but they were framed paintings of weird symbols. A huge painting just above the dinner table showed a witch being burnt at the stake. The whole place suddenly seemed cultish. I sat down at the table, pretending that everything was okay. I guess I didn't do a good job though, because Robbie asked me what was wrong. His parents both stared at me, waiting for an answer. I asked Robbie if I could talk to him in private. He laughed and said, "Sure, after we eat." The food looked pretty normal, but if it were poisoned or something, I wouldn't be able to tell. My plate was already filled with food. Just in case, I turned to Robbie and asked, "Actually, I know this is weird, but can we switch places? It looks like yours has more mashed potatoes." Catherine reached for the bowl of potatoes, ready to serve me more, but I ignored her and swapped my plate for Robbie's. If they wanted to poison me, I wasn't going to take any chances. Robbie gave me a strange look, but he didn't say anything. When he started eating from the plate that was originally meant for me, I knew that there wasn't any poison involved. I had just let the cashier's weird warning go to my head. I started eating too. Everything tasted normal. Then Catherine stood up, holding up her champagne. "Let's have a toast." I started to worry that there was something wrong with my drink. We clinked glasses and drank at the same time, but I kept my lips closed so that I didn't swallow anything. Robbie's parents looked at me suspiciously, but they didn't say anything. After the meal was over, I helped Catherine clean up. Then I pulled Robbie aside and showed him what the cashier had written. I thought he would laugh and say it was all some small town joke. That's what I hoped would happen. Instead, he got this really disappointed look and said, "Well, crap, you caught us." Then he shouted for his parents to enter in the room. They hurried in. "What is it, son?" his father asked. "She knows," he told them. Then he looked right at me. This should have been easy. All he had to do was drink your champagne and everything would be easy. But no, you had to ask questions. "What's going on?" Before Robbie could answer, his parents raced forward and grabbed my arms to hold me still. Then Robbie left for the kitchen. He came back with another glass of champagne. "I'm sorry, babe, it's not your fault. But we need to fill our sacrifice quota for the season. Just open up your mouth and it'll be fast." He pushed the glass against my lips and tried to pour it into my mouth. He pinched my nose so that I couldn't breathe, and his parents held me so hard that I couldn't twist out of the way. "Just drink it," he screamed into my face. He never talked to me like that before. All the time we'd spent together, it was all a lie. He was never really my boyfriend. He was just playing a long con, lowering my defenses so he could take me back to his hometown and sacrifice me to whatever messed up religion they found. I opened up my mouth to breathe, and that's when he started pouring the champagne down my throat. It filled my mouth, but I refused to swallow. I started choking. His parents squeezed me tighter. My choking got worse, and Robbie pulled the glass away from my mouth. I spat out everything I could. Then he tried again, this time more forcefully. I guess the fear of death took over me. I couldn't move my body, so I slammed my head forward, knocking the glass out of his hand. It shattered on the floor, spilling the champagne onto the carpet. His parents, surprised by my sudden movement, loosened their grip. I shoved them out of the way and raced for the door. As they chased after me, I ran to Robbie's car and locked myself inside. Thankfully, I still had Robbie's keys in my pocket. All three of them pounded on the car door, screaming for me to come out. I turned on the ignition and drove out of there. Thanks to Robbie's quick tour of the town, I remembered where the police station was. I drove straight there, ready to report the attempted poisoning. A policeman greeted me, but I noticed the same symbols on his office wall that were in Robbie's house. He was part of the cult too. I guess a lot of the town was. That was why the cashier had to write me a note instead of telling me directly. She didn't know who was listening in. The policeman asked me what was wrong. I told him never mind, and then I left. I drove all the way back to Boise, the nearest big city, where I went to a real police station to report what happened. The cop wrote everything down and said he'd look into it. I'm still waiting for answers. It's been over a month and I haven't heard anything from Robbie or his family. I'm in constant fear that they'll come after me to finish their sacrifice. But if they do, I'm going to be ready.
"Look, girl, I've got $100 if you show me your jugs," he said to me, and everything else fell numb to my hearing. The entire Mardi Gras festival, which had been one big escape for me from the drag of my desk job, suddenly stopped being fun. I watched the colors up close, but it all seemed like a shade of gray, dull and unimpressive, just like the smiles and the partying. I didn't want to show a man I didn't know my body. He had a curious face. His head was so bald it was shiny. But he maintained a full blonde beard with a mustache so long it covered his mouth. His eyes were brown, and his dilated pupils, in contrast with the rest of his whites, made him look a darker shade. "No, you creepy ass," I blurted, turned around, and muttered a cuss word under my breath as I continued to scan the crowd for my friends. I looked this way and that, and up the crowd, and just there I saw a familiar hat. I drifted in that direction through the jungle of partying bodies that had become sticky with sweat. I had dismissed him in my head, and for all intent, I had imagined he was gone when I walked away from him, like many of the other creeps at the festival. Slipping through the bodies that moved like an animated maze soon tired me out, and I turned my direction instead towards the sidewalk. I climbed the sidewalk and marched briskly towards the hat. From where I stood to where I wanted to go, exactly where I had left my friends, there was an alley. I had no idea about this until I felt such strong hands come from behind to seize my arm, forcing me into the corner. I was stunned when I turned around, and there he was, the creepy stranger with the shiny bald head and blonde mustache. He pulled me so forcefully that I could not speak through the silence that was my confusion. The crowd around us turned their attention to us, and before I could speak, he spoke first to their inquiring gaze. "She stole something from me. Can you believe this shit?" he muttered, and the crowd suddenly backed away. If I was not immediately scared to my pants of this stranger's overwhelming bulk of size and the danger he posed, I, too, would be impressed by how expertly he manipulated the entire situation. I moaned in protest, but the crowd shrugged me away and continued with their march. "Now listen here," he said, grinding his teeth. He recoiled his hips and pressed a knife to the side of my abdomen where the crowd could not see. "You will smile at the passing carnival and me off until I get my release. If I like it, I won't tear your belly open." My head spun. It was as though I were an onlooker in my own violation. But in that moment, it was not that which worried me. It was the horror of his knife in my stomach, tearing my stomach open while I bleed to death. The possibility of him mingling with the large crowd and escape was not beyond thinking. Fear crippled me, and I whimpered an apology to him, asking him to not hurt me. He pressed his knife a little into my flesh, and I looked. I quivered like a leaf on a breezy evening, flowing with a rash gust that I could neither contain nor understand. The knife was sharp, deadly steel, and the menace in this stranger's eyes betrayed a willingness to use it on me. It was all the warning I needed. Tears veiled my eyes. My body yearned for salvation as day turned to bleak night in the pool of my teary eyes. I was terrified for my life, and it caused my chest to open up. I could scarcely breathe. The numbness of all my senses peaked. I struggled to keep myself standing, up on my feet even as my knees buckled. The sensations in my head manifested into the outer world, and I saw the world itself spinning, round and around the core of my terror. "I've killed people for less disrespect," he said as he pressed the knife even further. My lips parted, and before I could speak, he proved it by jabbing his knife into my flesh, puncturing me to reveal a thin, bloodied stream that ran down his blade. I gasped in the shock of watching myself bleed. "You make any loud noise and I make the wound bigger. Do as I tell you and I might let you live," he whispered to me, pressing me against the wall. "These light won't even notice your dead body until the cops come for it. You'd be just another accident." I reached my hands to grab him slowly, just as he had asked me to. My stomach roiled with revulsion, and every second that I was there, held against my will with the tip of a knife pressed into the side of my stomach while the Mardi Gras festival went on by, felt like hellish torture. My body struggled to absorb it. I felt warm from within, my body burning up with dread-induced fever. It did not offend my senses that I was being in the open as much as the thought that other festival goers were passing by without stopping because those before them had not stopped. One of the best weeks of my life had quickly dipped into a nightmare. The tears in my eyes beaded and streaked down my face as I choked on my scream for help, knowing that meant being stabbed. Thoughts raced through my mind at a mind-bending pace. "Bring it out," he commanded me. I obeyed him, and my world froze. I did not see David through the film of tears in my hat. Not even his fancy beads and his hat slipped into my consciousness as I was totally detached from the horrifying experience with the stranger. All I saw was a heavy fist flying at the speed of light, whooshing past my face and landing on the side of the stranger's ears. The collision of David's fist and the stranger's skull sounded like an explosion had just gone off. The stranger's body was flat out on the ground. "Becca, did he hurt you?" David asked, managing his attention between me and the stranger. The marching stopped, and a crowd from the festival stopped to see what was happening. I whispered what had happened to Dave through tears, and he pulled me in for a hug, assuring me I was safe from the terrifying episode. In a matter of minutes, the cops arrived, even though I had no clarity of mind to know when they had been called. My testimony was taken, and the stranger was placed under arrest. Then I went home, promising myself that it will take a lot to get me to go for another Mardi Gras. I planned to spend the night unwinding with Netflix, some wine, and working on my sketches. My job had other plans. I worked at a tailor shop, and we had more orders than we could handle, so the owner and I had been taking some orders home to finish to try and catch up. This night was one of those. I got home from work, sat at my sewing machine, and worked some more. I did a couple of hours before I decided to stop and start with my original plan. I grabbed some Kraft mac and cheese from my cabinet and started boiling water. While I waited for the water to boil, I meandered over to my desk to assess my sketches from last night. I was creating a portfolio to apply to a fashion school in New York City. I felt like I was rotting away in this small town, and I think I had the vision to really go somewhere. I turned on the TV to Netflix to watch some mind-numbing docuseries while I worked on my sketches. I started scrolling through my options when someone knocked on my door. Weird, I thought. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my neighbors never bothered me. I looked through the peephole on my door and saw no one. So I opened the door and peered out. Still, there was no one to be found. On my doorstep, someone left takeout. I looked around one more time. Someone must have delivered to the wrong door, I thought. I snatched up the takeout before someone else could claim it as theirs. This would beat the mac and cheese I was making. I turned off the stove and dumped the water in the sink. I opened up the bags to find a feast. There was fried rice, chow mein, beef and broccoli, a chicken dish, and some egg rolls. I was thrilled. All that food would last me days, and I could never eat out because it was so expensive. I made up a plate and sat down at my desk with a view of the TV. I scarfed it down. You would have thought I hadn't eaten in days by the way I inhaled the fried rice. With a full stomach, I cleaned my few dishes and sat down to get to work. A Netflix docuseries about some online cult droned on in the background while I worked designing garments worthy of the Met Gala. I was barely into the first episode when I started feeling sleepy. The clock read 7:30 p.m., so it was still early, way too early to go to bed just yet, and I hadn't even finished one sketch. I tried to stay awake, but soon enough, my eyes were closed and my head was on my desk. I fell asleep to a girl giving her account of how a cult leader forced her into an abusive relationship. I woke with a start. I was sitting up in a chair, but I wasn't in my apartment. I was in a poorly lit room with my arms tied behind a chair. I looked around, and the only lights illuminated brilliant works of art. There were some abstract pieces and portraits. It looked like one was an attempt at a landscape, but the painter got frustrated and took it in a more abstract route. My heart was racing. I pulled and wiggled, trying to loosen the knot around my wrists, but it didn't budge. My mind raced. How did I end up here? Where am I? How did someone get into my apartment and move me? Behind me, I heard someone breathing heavily and brushstrokes on a canvas. "Hello?" I yelled out. A paintbrush clattered on the floor. "Oh, thank God, you're awake, finally," a man's voice said. I heard his footsteps come closer and closer until he came up around me. "Stephen Crawley," he said, reaching out his hand. He laughed. "Oh, right. A bit tied up? What's going on?" "I'm Stephen Crawley," he said again. I looked around. "Okay, I'm Hank. What's going on?" "Haven't you heard of me?" Stephen started getting frustrated. "No," I said. "Me? The brilliant Stephen Crawley? The ingenious painter exploring how true art can only be found through true suffering?" "Not ringing any bells, but I'm not up on painters. Try not to take it personally," I said. His face turned red. "Oh, but I do take it personally." "What am I doing here?" "You're here to help," he said with an unsettling smile. "You don't know me, but I know you, Hank O'Brien. In fact, you tailored these pants." He posed a few different ways for me to see. "Your boss showed me some of your sketches, and I must admit, while I'm not a fashion man, I was impressed." "Thank you," I said. "So, did you kidnap me?" I was more confused than anything. Stephen struck me as a proud artist, but not a killing madman. I didn't understand why he would go through the trouble of kidnapping me. "Good, yes!" His anger subsided some. "Do you know why you're here?" "No, I asked you, but you told me your name instead." I wasn't sure if I was in danger or if he just wanted someone to look at his art. His face grew red again at my response. He let out a frustrated yell. "Have you heard about the string of missing people in the news?" I shook my head. I don't really watch the news much. His face grew redder. "Well, there's a string of missing artists. Look around." I looked around, but all I saw was his art and him. I shrugged. "I'm not sure what reaction you're hoping for here. Can you untie me? I think the ropes are cutting off my circulation," he yelled again. "No! You're here to help me complete my mission. Look around. Each piece was inspired by a young, aspiring artist like yourself." He walked to a portrait of a young woman. "It all started with Scarlett.
I met her at a coffee shop she worked at. She did these most brilliant sketches. She did one of me, and I have never had someone capture me like her.
He walked to the next piece, an abstract one.
Then there was Cam. He did glass sculptures. He mostly wasted his talent creating bongs and pipes, but he showed me the most beautiful dolphin statue he did once when bored.
I was confused where he was going with this. So, you want me to help you inspire a painting?
Yes, exactly! You see, I believe true art is only born from suffering. Scarlett started drawing after her stepfather did unspeakable things. That was her suffering. Cam turned to glass blowing to get away from his messed up home. You turned to fashion because of bullying, correct? How do you know that? I do my research.
He winked.
In my life, I have had no such suffering. I was born into a loving, financially secure family, but I desire greatness. I want to be remembered as a daring artist. So I must create my own suffering. I find other great artists, and from their pain, I create masterpieces. Wouldn't you say I've created some genius works?
Yeah, they're impressive. So, do you just want to hear about my story and get inspired from that? Stephen shook his head and turned my chair to face the canvas he was working on.
This piece will be forged through your suffering.
All of his paintings were done in red and black paint. There was only black paint so far on this one. I looked around, and to the right of his canvas was a desk with brushes and knives. My heart began to pound in my chest. What did he need knives for? I strained my neck, trying to see how dark a red he used in his other paintings.
Can you elaborate on my suffering?
Stephen smiled at me and walked over to his workstation. He started picking up different sized knives.
With Scarlett, we used a small scalpel to make deep cuts on her beautiful face. I held up a mirror so she had to watch. With Cam,
Stephen picked up the bigger knife.
we cut off each of his fingers.
A lump in my throat formed. Stephen continued.
And from their blood, masterpieces were born. And now, it's your turn.
Stephen picked up a big needle with thick, dark thread. I started pulling at the rope behind me with vigor now. I need to keep him talking, I thought. What are you going to do with me?
I'm going to sew your mouth shut. And I guess I'll do your fingers next.
I started to feel the rope loosen.
Keep him talking,
I reminded myself.
Have you really never been through anything? Like, your whole life has been peachy? My parents never approved of my art.
Stephen started going on about his parents' negligence in fostering his art. I asked questions as I continued to loosen the ropes more and more until, finally, my hand was free. I jumped out of the chair. Stephen started approaching, and I picked up the chair and threw it at him. I started running away, desperate for an exit. There had to be a door around here somewhere. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a window. I ran up to it, opened it, and crawled out. The night air felt refreshing on my skin.
Get back here!
Stephen yelled, running after me. Before he reached the window, I was off. I ran to the nearest road and waited for a car to stop. When someone finally did, I asked them to take me to a police station. I explained everything to the cops, and they sped over to Stephen's warehouse. There, they found multiple pieces of art, but Stephen was nowhere to be found. They tested the paintings, and the DNA matched a few missing person reports. They did a manhunt for Stephen, but it's like he vanished into thin air. They talked to his parents, but they said they hadn't talked to him in years. As for me, I moved. I'm still working on applying to art school,
Now I want to get out of this town even more than I did before.
Last month, I was supposed to go camping with my cousin Frank, but I'd gotten into a fight with my girlfriend Trudy, and I had to cancel on him. I expected him to reschedule for the next weekend, but instead, he decided to go alone. I tried to tell him that it was a bad idea. He didn't know the area as well as I did, but he wouldn't listen. I think he was mad at me for bailing on him, especially because he never liked Trudy at all. So he left Saturday morning, and I was hoping to hear from him when he got there, but he never texted. I tried calling him a couple times, but he didn't respond. I thought that maybe he couldn't get reception up in the mountains, but I knew that wasn't true. I'd been up there plenty of times before, and I'd always been able to make calls. By Sunday, I was getting pretty nervous. I called the police to report him missing, but when I explained everything, they told me that I was being paranoid, because I mentioned the argument that we had beforehand. They just assumed that Frank didn't want to answer my calls. Frustrated, I decided to drive up to the campgrounds myself and try to find him. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I parked near the ranger station and saw a couple of other cars in the lot. I was about to head up the trail when I realized that one of the cars was familiar. It was Trudy's. Why was my girlfriend's car here? Confused, I decided to call her. She answered immediately. "Trudy, where are you right now?" "On a walk," she said. Clearly, she was hiding something from me. "Hey, do you know where Frank is? Your cousin?" No." Then I heard a noise in the background. "Sorry, gotta go." And she hung up on me. I went into the ranger station to see if anyone had seen Frank or Trudy, but the place was empty. Just in case, I left a note and then headed back to the trail. The campgrounds were pretty big, so I wasn't sure I was going in the right direction, but I kept walking. I passed a few empty cabins and a small stream. I recognized the area well enough, so I knew I wasn't going to get lost. I continued towards the area where Frank and I had gone camping before, and sure enough, I saw his tent, backpack, and a pair of sneakers. I knew this was his stuff because he decorated his backpack with stickers from his favorite rock bands. He wasn't there, though. I went through his backpack just in case, but it was mostly empty. Just a few packages of chips and water. By then, I was really nervous. I searched around their campsite and I couldn't find anything. Just in case, I called Frank again. This time, I heard his phone ringing in the distance. Filled with hope, I raced towards the sound. I ended up in a patch of forest that I'd never seen before. The ringing stopped. I started to call him again when someone walked out of the woods. It wasn't Frank. It was Trudy. "What are you doing here?" I asked her. She took a deep breath and then explained that she'd come here to see Frank. She admitted that she was with him since last month, ever since we'd started fighting. "You cheated on me? With Frank?" I asked. She nodded, but he felt really guilty about it, so he left me last night. I haven't seen him since, and I think he got lost. She held up the phone in her hands. He left his phone behind too. I couldn't tell if she was lying to me. I always assumed that she and Frank hated each other, but maybe that was just an act. "Why didn't you tell me this when I called you?" "Because I was ashamed. I'm so sorry." I was angry, of course, but mostly I was scared. Even though Frank betrayed me, I didn't want anything bad to happen to him. "I've been looking for him all morning," Trudy added. "Do you want me to help?" "Okay, fine." Together, we continued walking through the forest. She pointed towards all the areas that she already looked. I followed her lead. She took me deeper and deeper into the forest. We didn't say much to each other. Eventually, we made it to a cliff overlooking the valley. If Frank had walked here at night, he might have fallen over the edge. I was filled with dread. Trudy reached the cliff first. She looked over the edge and gasped. Oh no! I joined her. Looking down, I saw Frank's body lying dead on the ground. Trudy started to cry. This is all my fault. I should have stopped him. He said he was going back to his car, but I guess he got turned around. Something wasn't making sense. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I looked closer at Frank's body. You said he was trying to get back to his car? Yeah. Then why is he not wearing any shoes? Trudy started to smile. Because I lied. I threw him down there. What? Before I could react, she grabbed my arms and started shoving me towards the cliff. She was still smiling. I'm bigger and stronger than Judy, but she'd taken me by surprise. Before I knew it, she had me hanging over the edge. I couldn't stop her. Why? I yelled. Steve, I think we should see other people. Then she threw me off the cliff. I remember falling all the way down, but I don't remember landing. I guess I passed out from the pain. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but eventually I was able to open my eyes. Both my legs were throbbing in pain, obviously broken. The side of my face was scratched and bleeding, but I was alive. I turned my head and saw Frank's body just a few feet away. He wasn't so lucky. His head was twisted unnaturally to the side. With effort, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I ended up talking to the same dispatcher who talked to me before. Remember me? The guy you said was being paranoid? Well, my cousin's dead, and I'm badly hurt. I told her my location and she contacted the Rangers. I'm at the hospital now, with casts on both my legs. The doctor said I'm most likely going to make a full recovery. The police are still looking for Trudy. When they do, I'll finally find out why she snapped.
Last month, my boyfriend Juan took me on a camping trip in California. Camping really isn't my thing, but I knew he wanted to go. When he's happy, I'm happy. Besides, he seemed kind of anxious when he brought it up. The trip clearly meant something to him, so I could only assume that he was going to finally propose. We parked near the ranger station and picked up a couple of maps. The ranger warned us about places to stay away from, but Juan assured him that we'd be fine. And then we started hiking. I hated it. I hated every second of it. Even though I bought the right shoes from an outdoor supply store, my feet were throbbing in pain. I needed constant breaks. I was always out of breath. And Juan just kept talking. He had all the energy in the world, and it felt like he was purposely ignoring how difficult it was for me. We'd gotten pretty high up the first mountain, and I desperately needed to sit down. I asked Juan if we could take a break now. He looked around for a while, and then said, "Yeah, this is a good spot." We were on a relatively flat area toward the top of the mountain, and had a beautiful view of the valley below. He unzipped his backpack and pulled out the tent. "You set this up, and I'll go gather firewood." I really didn't know how to pitch a tent, but at least I didn't have to stand up while I was doing it. Before he left, he sprayed me with some anti-bear spray, just in case. It smelled awful, but at least it didn't get in my eyes. By the time I finished pitching the tent, Juan still hadn't returned. I started to get a little nervous. Even though we couldn't get cell reception out here, I needed to grab my phone and see what time it was. He had to have been gone at least an hour. But when I reached into my backpack, my phone was gone. So was Juan's. He'd taken them both when he left. But why? I looked through the whole backpack, and I saw that the maps were gone too. So was our food and water. There was only one explanation. He left me behind. He wanted me to get lost out there. I was furious. I looked around the campsite, but there was no sign of him. I needed to get back down to the ranger station before dark, but I didn't know which direction to go in. While coming up here, Juan had purposely changed paths a couple of times. Now I knew why. At the very least, I knew that I needed to go downhill. I didn't bother bringing anything with me. I left the whole tent where it was. It was a lot easier to walk downhill. I didn't feel as sore. Of course, I was also driven by anger. By the afternoon, I felt like I'd been walking forever. I was starting to lose hope. Until I saw a large man up ahead. He was leaning against a tree, but I couldn't see his face through the leaves. "Hey!" I called out as I sped up to reach him. The man turned to look at me, and I almost screamed. It wasn't a man at all. It was a bear. I stood frozen, too afraid to move. I silently prayed that the anti-bear spray would drive it away. Unfortunately, it did the exact opposite. The bear sniffed a few times, and then it went absolutely wild. It charged at me, roaring. That's when I knew the full extent of my boyfriend's plan. He hadn't just abandoned me in the wilderness. He had sprayed me with some spray that attracted bears, not repelled them. He wanted me to get eaten. And soon I would be. I kept running as fast as I could, but the bear was catching up. There was nothing I could do to stop it. Just as it swiped its claw at me, I did the only thing I could think of. I jumped off the cliff. I fell through the air, almost in slow motion, and struck the tops of trees. I felt the worst pain of my life as my body hit branch after branch during my fall. By the time I'd landed on the ground, I was unconscious from the pain. But at least the bear couldn't get me. I'm not sure how long I was passed out on the ground. Probably not too long. I woke up to a young couple standing over me. The boyfriend was gently shaking my shoulder. It took a while for my eyes to focus. "Are you okay?" the girlfriend asked. "No," I grumbled. "I just jumped off a cliff to avoid getting eaten." "By a bear?" she asked. I was in way too much pain to keep talking to these people. I told them to call the police instead of asking me all these questions. Now that we were out of the mountains and close to the ranger station, their cell phones could get enough bars to make a call. "We already called them," the man admitted, "after we saw the other person." I didn't know who they were talking about at first. I struggled to stand up. The man tried to stop me because I was pretty hurt from the fall, but with their help, I was able to stand and limp back toward the ranger station. Took only 5 minutes to get there, even though we were going at a really slow pace. The ambulance was already waiting. Someone was lying dead on the stretcher. I didn't need to see his face to know that it was Juan. He was the body that they'd found. I got closer, just to make sure. I recognized his face. Or at least, the top half. The bottom half, just below his nose, had been torn off. I couldn't stop myself from laughing at the irony. Juan had sprayed me with some chemical to attract bears, and yet he was the one to get killed by one. The last time I saw him, he was kissing me goodbye, after he'd sprayed me with the chemical. Served him right. After that, the ambulance took me to the hospital to patch me up. I'm okay now, but I still have nightmares about that forest. I will never go camping again.
My name is Penny. I was a secretary for most of my life, but when my husband Jackson found out he was going to get a promotion at work, I was able to quit my job and write mystery novels full-time. It was what I had always wanted to do with my life. I self-published my first book years ago, but it didn't sell a lot of copies. Jackson was extremely supportive, but I felt like a real failure. I swore to myself that my next book would be different. So as I was writing, I did a lot of research on marketing and sales. I watched some YouTube videos by some other mystery writers, and I took a lot of notes. Around the time I finished writing my new book, Jackson had officially gotten his promotion. I had more money to spend on advertising, but I also needed to put in the work. I created a website and some social media accounts. Most importantly, I created a TikTok. One of the authors I followed said that the majority of her sales came from her TikTok followers. I had no idea how to use the platform, but I wouldn't let that stop me. I set up my camera outside the house and wrote a short speech to introduce myself. I practiced a few times and then filmed it. It took me an hour to make a 1-minute video, but I was pretty happy with the results. I posted it and shared the link on my new socials. At the end of the day, I had less than 20 views and very little engagement. It was a total failure, so I decided to go off script and film another video outside the house. This one was just me talking about how much I love murder mysteries. I was a lot more passionate in this one, but the view count was still really low. I was about to give up on the whole TikTok experiment until I looked at my phone the next morning and saw that my second video had gone viral. I couldn't believe it. Over one night, I went from 10 views to a couple 100,000. I wanted to tell Jackson the good news, but he had already left for the day. So I fixed my morning coffee and started to look through all the comments. Right away, I realized that something was wrong. People were writing things like, "This can't be real," and "Did anyone else see that?" I didn't get it. I kept scrolling until I found one comment that really struck me. The body looks so realistic. I rewatched the video to figure out what was going on, and I didn't see anything strange. It was just me looking into the camera with our little garden and tool shed in the background. Then about halfway through, I saw movement in the background, so I started from the beginning and watched again. That's when I saw what everyone was talking about. When I filmed my video, Jackson was in the far background. He was dragging a dead body from the house to the tool shed. It was too far away to see clearly, but it looked like an overweight man in a business suit. He pulled the body behind the tool shed, then reappeared to grab a shovel. Before I could see what he'd do next, the video ended. My video had accidentally captured my husband burying a body. No wonder it went viral. People thought it was all a setup to help me sell my murder mystery books. It took me a while to really grapple with what this meant. Jackson was a killer. My husband of 8 years, the love of my life, was a killer. I didn't call the police, even though I should have. I had to see for myself first. So I checked the garage to make sure Jackson's car was gone, and then I nervously walked toward the tool shed. The shovel Jackson had used was still leaning against the wall. I grabbed it and started digging. It didn't take me long to hit something. Covering my mouth, I scooped up enough dirt to find the body. It was Mr. Billings, the man who used to have Jackson's job. Is that why he'd been promoted? Because he had killed the guy above him? I tried to think back to when Jackson had told me about his promotion. He said that Mr. Billings had moved away. Obviously, he was lying. Horrified, I ran back inside the house and started to call the police. "Honey, what's going on?" I spun around to see Jackson standing behind me. I didn't hear him come back. "Nothing," I lied. "Aren't you supposed to be at work?" He explained that he came back to pick up some papers, but as he was talking, I could see him studying my expression. He was trying to figure out if I was onto him. His smile instantly disappeared when he had his answer. "I did it for you," he said. "What?" Jackson explained that his company had taken away his promotion when Mr. Billings decided to stay on for another 5 years. I had already quit my job, and he didn't have the heart to tell me we didn't have enough money, so he decided to make sure his promotion went through. It was disgusting. I'd never seen this side of my husband before, and I felt like throwing up. He stepped closer. "How did you find out?" I muttered one word. "TikTok." I don't know why I told him that. It just came out. Frantically, Jackson grabbed the phone from my hands before I could finish dialing 911. He opened my TikTok. I tried to pull the phone out of his hands, but he pushed me back. I fell onto the ground and my phone slid under the couch. "Don't hurt me!" I screamed. He stood over me, his eyes red and crazed. "I'm not a bad person." You killed someone! He laughed coldly. Then he asked if I was going to say anything. I have to, I told him. People already saw you. It's on the internet now. Wrong answer. He dove on top of me. His hands reached around my neck. He squeezed. Don't, I sputtered. Please. He didn't look like my husband anymore. He looked like a total stranger. He squeezed so hard, everything was turning black. I knew I was going to die. I didn't, though. I just passed out. But when I woke up, I was tied to the couch. Jackson stood in front of me, waiting for me to wake up. He said he wasn't going to let me go until I promised to keep his secret. He'd gotten away with the perfect murder, and he couldn't let me get in the way. I begged him to reconsider. I knew he still loved me. He had to. He slowly, calmly explained everything he'd done to Mr. Billings, all the ways he was able to cover his tracks, and he reminded me over and over that he did it for us. There was nothing I could say to reason with him. Something had snapped in his brain. I felt completely hopeless. Finally, I said, "Just kill me then. I'd rather be dead than married to a murderer." He laughed once, and then he pulled a knife from his pocket. The same knife he'd used to kill Mr. Billings. He stepped closer, eyes wide. But before he could hurt me, the front door burst open and a bunch of cops rushed in. Jackson didn't put up much of a fight as they'd held him down and handcuffed him. One of the cops untied my ropes. "How did you find me?" I asked. "We got dozens of calls from your TikTok fans," he answered. With my hands untied, I reached under the couch and pulled out my phone. My phone was in the middle of live streaming. It had recorded the audio of everything that had happened. I guess one of us had pressed the record button when Jackson and I were fighting over the phone. I looked directly into the camera at my thousands of new followers and I said, "Thanks. I promise you my new book will be just as exciting."
Being a travel nurse wasn't easy. Well, being any type of nurse wasn't easy, with the long, exhausting hours, back-to-back shifts, mentality-draining situations, and the regular high stakes of the job. Adding constant travel and lack of routine to that mix wasn't for everyone. I worked for 5 years as a regular nurse in Phoenix until I took the plunge and became a travel nurse. The road, until I got accustomed to the hurdles of the job, was extremely challenging, and I even considered giving up and going back home many times. But for someone that prioritizes flexibility and higher pay, being a travel nurse was the best thing for me. My agency sent me a 6-week contract in rural Arizona with an amazing net pay per week and a high stipend, and it was perfectly located 45 minutes away from my parents' house, so I could pocket the stipend money by not having to pay for housing or accommodations. Also, I would get to spend the days I wasn't working with my parents, just enjoying their company. My mom had been vibrating with excitement since I made the call, letting her know I was heading their way. It was a win-win. While driving through the 89 towards Flagstaff, the low gas signal on my dashboard lit up, and I fixed my eyes on the road for the first gas station nearby. One didn't appear for the next 10 miles or so, and even then, it was such a small place, I briefly wondered if it was even working to begin with. But the light at the convenience store was the only bright thing in the night, so I figured it was worth a shot. Besides, there was another car by the air station. So I parked parallel to one pump and got out to fill my tank. Lord knew it was almost empty. Except the first one wasn't working. Or the second. But the third one was the charm, and the pump was on and seemed in order. When I went to take my card, however, it wouldn't budge. The thing was completely stuck inside the machine, and no amount of pulling or wiggling or a combination of both would get it out. I looked towards the big glass window of the convenience store, but didn't see anyone inside. The lights were still on, including the one of a small refrigerator in the back, so I knew someone had to be there, somewhere. Frustrated, I pressed the help button on the pump and waited for a response. Not even 10 seconds later, I heard a male voice over the intercom. Yes? When I looked back at the glass window, there was a clerk standing behind the counter, looking mighty annoyed with me. Ignoring the fact that he wasn't there less than a minute ago, I pushed the button again so he could hear me. Hi, my card got stuck in the machine. Can you help? If you hold the exit button and pull the card, it should come out, ma'am. I did as he instructed, but it was still stuck. Well, it didn't. I couldn't understand why the guy just wouldn't come out. I waved at him and motioned towards the pump, but he still didn't move, not even an inch. Can't you just come here and help, please? After much trouble, I watched as the guy finally rounded the corner of the balcony and made his way outside towards me. I couldn't say he was a creepy-looking guy, but I couldn't say he wasn't either. There was just something about him that made you uneasy. Maybe his face was too gaunt, or his body too lanky. I didn't know. But he definitely gave me the proverbial heebie-jeebies the whole time he stood beside me, basically opening the machine to get my card out. He would steal glances at me now and then, that I returned with uncomfortable half-smiles. After my card was finally freed, that pump could no longer be used, so he told me to go inside and pay in cash. And it was pure luck I still had any on me. We went in, and as he was counting the change, I purposefully didn't look at him. But I could feel that he was staring at me the whole time. I couldn't wait to be out of there and far away from this creep. He handed me the cash, his cold, twitchy fingers sliding against mine, and I put it in my pocket without even checking it. I just wanted out. As I turned around, my eyes quickly landed on that big, convex mirror most convenience stores have. And that was when I saw it. Right by the corner. There was someone, a girl maybe, with their hands and feet bound. A cold shiver went over my whole body, from head to toe. I suddenly found myself frozen in place, unable to move, not even a single muscle. Who was that person? What were they doing there? Did the clerk kidnap them? Then I remembered the car already parked outside when I arrived, and my mind put the two and two together. The person under the balcony had to be the owner of the car. Something wrong? His voice called my attention back, and I realized I probably stood there for way too long. I had to say something, anything, so he wouldn't suspect I'd seen it. My solution was to ask for a pack of cigarettes, and after he gave it to me, I nearly flew out of there. Once inside my car and about a mile away from the gas station, I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were shaking so much I feared they would turn the wheel in a different direction. I kept driving, but my mind was still focused on the person under the balcony. I couldn't leave them there, alone and scared. What if he killed the person? He could. No one kidnapped another person or held them hostage if they weren't ready for some serious violence. Damn, I had to get back there. Cursing my lack of judgment, I stopped the car on the side of the road, got my lantern and my emergency nursing kit, my phone, and I went walking into the night, headed back to the gas station. I was sensible enough to call 911 and report the emergency, but we were in the middle of nowhere. God only knew how long it would take them to get there. I had to act fast. When I spotted the faint light of the convenience store, I ducked down to avoid being seen. The car by the air station was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, and since it was outside the range of the convenience store's window, I risked opening it. The documents inside the glove compartment told me it belonged to an Anne Marie Toombs, 21, from California. God, she was so young, barely even an adult yet. I had to be smart about it. Otherwise, we would both end up in trouble, not just her. As I tried to come up with a game plan to successfully save someone from captivity, a desperate, pain-filled screech broke into the night. He was hurting her. There was no doubt about it. My brain immediately went into the zone. The same place it went in a packed hospital, with dozens of people pulling at us nurses from all directions, begging for help. Clutching at my emergency bag, I rounded the corner, staying close to the wall, looking for another point of entry. Sadly, I couldn't find any back entrance, so the only way in was through the front door. And the one thing I remembered about it was how it creaked when it opened. Okay, so there was no way of getting in without being heard. That made things difficult, not to say nearly impossible. Still, what choice did I have? It wasn't like I could... The car! I remembered noticing that Anne's car was one of those models that had a panic button on the key fob. I went back towards it, grabbed the key fob, and walked towards the convenience store, careful to remain hidden. The alarm rang incredibly loud into the quiet night, and it didn't take long until the clerk was fumbling outside to check. Without missing a beat, I took that opportunity to get inside, praying that the noise of the alarm would be enough to mask the door's noise. Once inside, the place was eerily calm. My footsteps rang loud in my ears as I made my way towards a dark corridor that led to 3 other doors. I found her in the last one, marked maintenance room. Something I didn't notice before was that a dark cloth covered her eyes, so when she heard me getting in, her first instinct was to scream and beg for me to let her go. I crouched beside her in an instant, covering her mouth. "Shh, I'm here to help you, Anne," I whispered, still paying attention to the noise outside from the alarm.
I'll get you out of here. I promise.
Briefly assessing her for injuries was a mistake, because she looked terrible. Bruises on top of one another, many cuts, all in different stages of healing. It was clear that she'd been tortured, by the looks of it, for at least a few days. I grabbed the shears from my emergency kit and cut the rope from her feet. Taken aback when removing the tight material also took bits of her skin with it. She wouldn't make it one step out of there without some very strong painkiller, so I quickly prepared a syringe with medication to give it to her. In my hyper-focused state, I failed to notice that the alarm outside had stopped, and that was a big mistake. Next thing I knew, a vicious grip on my hair dragged me away from Anne and towards the opposite wall, slamming me against it. The pain was sharp, agonizing, and spread all over my body in a quick wave. I realized then that the sharp remaining part of a metal pipe had briefly impaled my arm on impact. Now I was the one who needed a very strong painkiller. I had no time to get my bearings because the clerk caught up to me quickly, holding me by the neck, alternating between choking me and hitting my head against the tiles. The syringe fell just inches away from my hand, but it might as well be miles away. I couldn't reach it. My vision was already fading along the edges, and the last image I would ever see was the snarling, deformed face of the clerk, killing me. I heard a desperate grunt, followed by a loud scream, and I opened my eyes to find that Anne, even with her hands still bound and incredibly weak, managed to stab the clerk's inner thigh with my shears. Immediately, he started bleeding profusely. If it sliced through a major artery, it could be enough to incapacitate him. Still, I didn't want to take any chances. As he writhed on the floor, clearly in agony, I saw my opportunity. I straddled his torso, grabbed the syringe from the floor, and then with both hands and using all my strength, stabbed him with it. Underneath me, his body twisted like a bolt of electricity zapped him. And then he stopped moving, completely. The syringe went right into the middle of his left, still sticking out like a weird flagpole. The sight was absurd enough it almost made me laugh. Anne and I stared at each other in total disbelief. Somehow, we'd made it. We were alive. Then, we had to nearly drag ourselves towards the front door and wait for the police. They couldn't come soon enough. One thing was certain. I would think twice, 3 times even, before stopping at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. The superstar Ethan Blake died before I was born. but I knew about him. I knew so much about him that I idolized his entire life. I was just a kid when I was introduced to the glamorous, carefree, and all the other liberties of life a superstar like Ethan Blake could afford. It was like watching a movie, only that my mother would squeal a reminder every other minute that it was all real. It is easy to understand how Ethan Blake became my idol if you understood how much my mother lived for him. He had been everything to her in her younger years. He had appeal like no one else in his era did, and would sell out records on the same day as he released them. His fans, fanatic to the point of frenzied participation just like my mother, were all over the world. From America to Australia, Africa, Europe, and Asia. A true global phenomena that many knew and loved. I suspect the love was so intense for Ethan Blake because these people had seen themselves in him. He had maintained an aura that had pulled them in and made them a part of his world. In a way, they felt they were him. Tragic things happen when a star drifts too close to the sun. The gods become jealous and snatch the light from its core. It was what happened with Ethan Blake. He died in a plane crash during a sold-out tour in Asia. My mother talks about it with such a somber air as the Pope would talk about the death of Christ. Every bit of joy sucked from her face, and the atmosphere would turn tense as she narrated the moment. Occasionally, she would drop her face into her palm to grieve him. I had gone through tapes of the incident myself, and I had just seen the same reaction from people when they found out he had died in a plane crash. Now, even though I was born years after he died, I was just as intrigued by the life that he lived, and the way that he chose to live it, that I did what many most have thought of, but none before me had done. Or maybe my mother did it first, because she named me Ethan Blake, just like the pop idol that so many people admired. But, to mark the 30th occasion of his death, I underwent a surgical operation to bear his looks. I was a college grad at the time, and I had all of the hours in a day to think of an execution, whatever thought it was that had come up in my head. The Ethan Blake operation was one of my better ideas. My mom had been pleased with the outcome of the surgery, and she had even burst into tears when she saw me, telling me just how much like Ethan Blake she thought I looked. It was the highlight of that surgery. Sheer horror awaited me weeks after I had the surgery. The thrill had subsided after a while, and I had gotten used to being identified in public by people way older than me as Ethan Blake. It was not unusual that they would walk up to me and try to touch my face to see if I was real. But the worst incident was on that lonely, dreadful night. The bustle of the road had been buried by a passing storm that had made the roads wet, leaving a slippery, vacant expanse of travel road for me on my way home. I had driven home with this innocence of mind and no expectations of drama. I had just turned into the driveway and put my car into park when I noticed her in my back seat. I was beyond mortified by her horrible look. Her skin was as pale as the moon in a stark, dreary night. Her eyes carried the shadows of her forehead, sunken holes on her face that provided no windows into her soul. Her lips were chapped, dried by the elements, and her hair appeared to have been messed with during the episode of a fight. Her cold demeanor filled the car, and I noticed that the reason that I had just seen her when I was in my driveway was because she had been laying down the entire time. My lips trembled, as did my hands. The air between us was fragile, tossed about with deliberate care so that neither of us could break it without the other's consent. The rear-view mirror was our means of communication.
Who the hell are you, and what are you doing in my car?
I turned around and barked at her. She covered the space between us quickly, as though she had been waiting on me to make my first move. My heart beating in my chest echoed in my ears. She placed a finger on my lip, and her face was mere inches from mine. It felt like a fever dream had caused me to fall into her hypnotizing, terrifying blue eyes. She smelled musky, like old perfume, rich but pungent from containment. Her lips moved as though she were speaking not to me, but at me. I folded my fist into a ball and ready to strike, but her eyes caught on to my action. Her face did not alter from the emotionless expression when she spoke. "You killed him, Ethan, after all he did for you," she said, and I noticed that she was struggling with tears. I was puzzled. I hadn't killed anybody. As I stared into her eyes and lost myself in the grief-stricken motion of her pupils, I had a sense I was in danger. But she was quicker. She retrieved a knife and stabbed it towards my neck to finish me off. I threw my hands up instinctively, and the blade ate into my arm. I cried in pain and tried to escape. She stabbed me again, and this time the blade sunk into my torso. I was out of the car in a hurry. "You took his song and made a name for yourself. A superstar off the song Larry wrote for you, and you gave him nothing," I heard her cry as she pursued after me. "He killed himself because his sweet heart could not bear such betrayal." She pursued me and jumped on me with her knife to stab me. I caught her hands and hollered back at her that I was not Ethan Blake, even though I shared the face and the name of the 80s pop star. I was chilled to my bones when she said she knew, and I was her only chance at retribution at the man who hurt her. At once, I recognized the look in her eyes, and I registered that they were glazed with madness. My heart was beating too fast from the terror of her satisfaction of having a chance to hack me to death. I was losing blood, and I knew it was a matter of time before she finished me off if I did not resist her. We struggled for control for a good period. Her frustration grew quickly, and the knife slipped into my hands. I grabbed it and turned it into her chest, lodging it for a whole minute until her body went limp. A neighbor found our bodies on the ground of my driveway, as I would find out from the doctor. The crazy would-be killer had died, and I was barely alive from such a horrifying experience.
My best friend Tori slept with my brother Ben during our big ski weekend last year. I was so upset. I warned Tori that my brother was off limits. There were so many other guys at the lodge, eligible bachelors and whatever. Why did she have to sleep with my brother? I felt like she stabbed me in the back. We got into a really big argument, and I told her that I never wanted to see her again. And guess what? I didn't. Because that afternoon, she went out skiing alone and never came back. When she left, the weather was perfect, but things changed very quickly, and she got caught in some kind of snowstorm. We all assumed that she died, but they never found the body. This all happened last winter, and I'm still not over it. I feel so guilty that our last conversation was such a terrible argument. When my boyfriend Steve suggested another ski trip exactly 1 year after Tori's disappearance, I thought the idea was terrible. How could we have fun with the memory of Tori's death looming over us the whole trip? So I said no. I said under no circumstances would I want to go back to the same ski lodge. There was just too many bad memories. I thought Steve understood how I felt. He was always so supportive, but he said that he was still going to go without me. I tried not to be upset, even though I kind of was. I felt like Steve was betraying Tori's memory too. And then my brother Ben called me up and changed my mind. He explained how guilty he felt over Tori's death because he was the one who caused the argument in the first place. He was the reason that she went out into the snowstorm without me. I hadn't realized that Ben felt guilty as I did. He explained that the reunion trip would be the best way for him to overcome that guilt. And hearing this logic from him made me reevaluate things. Maybe this would be a good trip. Maybe it would help me get some closure. So I called Steve and told him that I changed my mind. That weekend, we packed our bags, piled into Ben's SUV, and headed up to the ski lodge. The place looked exactly the same. It really was a beautiful lodge, wooden and spacious and rustic. The snow-covered peaks were gorgeous. On that first day, Steve and I hit the bunny slopes while Ben and his other friends hit the harder peaks. I tried to enjoy myself. I really did, but I couldn't stop thinking about Tori. We all got back into the lodge that evening. We were sitting by the fire. Ben was filming himself on his phone. Some of his friends were into it, and a couple weren't. I guess he'd spent all day filming himself for TikTok. His whole speech about feeling guilty was just BS. He just wanted us all to come back here so he could make videos about moving on after tragedy. He was using the anniversary of Tori's death to get more followers. Steve and I were sitting by the fire when Ben walked directly towards us while talking into his phone. He was live streaming, and he was going to make us be a part of it too. "Hey guys, tell the world how you're feeling right now." I covered my face with my hand and looked away. Steve was a bit more diplomatic. He looked into Ben's phone and said, "We're fine, thank you," with as much finality as he could. Ben got the hint and scurried off. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next day was even worse. Ben filmed everything we did, and worse, he kept following me and Steve around with his phone. Throughout the day, he posted clips of us skiing and sipping cocoa. He added sad music and captions like, "Moving on," or "Honoring her memory." He was in a lot of his videos, but more and more of them were just of me and Steve, but mostly me. I kept telling him to stop, but he refused. He said he was doing this for Tori. I wanted to punch him. At the end of the day, Steve and I were ready to head back inside and put our ski stuff away when Ben ran over. He asked if I wanted to do one more trip up the mountain. I told him no. He just wanted more footage of me. "Then let's make a deal," he said. "If we go up one more time, I promise I will never film you again." It seemed like some kind of trick, but I knew that my brother never went back on his word. If I did this, he'd stop making everything so awkward, so I agreed. Steve asked if he could come with us, but I knew he was just being supportive. He was already exhausted, and his knee was bugging him. I told him that I'd be okay, and then he left. Ben and I took a ski lift up to the mountain, where we were high up in the air. He took out his phone and started live streaming. "Hey guys, it's Ben again. I'm here with my sister. She's the one in all those videos, having an absolute blast, even though it's the anniversary of when she murdered Tori, the love of my life." Before the meaning of his words fully sank in, he turned the phone camera towards me. "Say hi to the world. Now's your chance to finally come clean. I think you have to, because if you don't..." He started wildly rocking our ski lift. I had to grab the bar. "What are you doing?" I screamed. He didn't answer. Instead, he just held the phone in my face, filming me close up. All this time, my brother blamed me for Tori's death? He thought I murdered her. And this whole trip was an elaborate way for me to make me confess publicly. "I didn't kill her," I screamed. He rocked the ski lift even harder. We still had at least a minute before we reached the top of the mountain. "Tell the truth," he said. "I didn't kill her." He screamed at me, kicked me with his foot. He went into a rage, kicking and kicking me until I'd plummet off to my death. I wrapped both my arms around the bar. He kicked me one more time, but I'd twist to the side just as his foot was about to hit my thigh. He was pushing so hard that he lost the grip on the bar and slid off. I watched in horror as my brother fell hundreds of feet to the snowy ground below. His phone was in his hand the whole time, filming everything. My brother never got the confession that he wanted, but at least he went viral. Steve and I had a long, silent ride home.
It all started with the catchup. I never thought a condiment could be the catalyst for the darkest chapter of my life, but here I was, staring at the remnants of our dinner with a hollow feeling in my chest. The evening began innocuously enough. Just another Thursday night with burgers sizzling on the grill and the promise of a relaxed family meal. But my husband, Ethan, had a knack for turning the mundane into the monstrous. "Where's the ketchup?" I asked, searching through the fridge. Ethan didn't look up from his plate. There wasn't much left, so I threw it out. My daughter Lily and I exchanged a glance. We both loved ketchup on our burgers. Annoyed, I muttered under my breath, "Would taste a lot better with ketchup." Ethan's head snapped up. "You completely ruined the night! I deserve so much better than you!" His words stung like a slap. There was no humor in his tone, no hint of jest, just cold, hard truth. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I forced a smile, hoping to diffuse the situation. "It's just ketchup, Ethan. No big deal." But it was a big deal. To him, it always was. Ethan thrived on control, and tonight I had challenged it, however inadvertently. The rest of the meal passed in silence, and I found myself retreating to the bedroom as soon as I could. I needed space to think, to process his words. Our marriage had been unraveling for months, but tonight felt like the breaking point. Ethan's anger simmered beneath the surface, a constant undercurrent that threatened to drag us both under. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. The following day, I decided to take Lily to the park, hoping a change of scenery would help clear my mind. The fresh air did little to soothe my anxiety. I found myself watching other families, envying their apparent happiness and ease. How had things gone so wrong? When we returned home, Ethan was waiting for us, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded, my stomach knotting with dread. We sat in the living room, Lily playing quietly in the corner, oblivious to the storm brewing between her parents. "I'm sorry about last night," Ethan began, his voice oddly calm. I overreacted. I waited, sensing there was more to come. "But you need to understand, Claire. I have certain expectations. If you can't meet them, maybe you're right. Maybe we should go our separate ways." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I knew it would only make things worse. Instead, I nodded, forcing myself to stay composed. "I'll do better," I promised, hating myself for the words. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself walking on eggshells, terrified of triggering another outburst. Ethan's mood swings became more frequent, his temper more volatile. I started keeping a journal, documenting every incident, every insult, hoping it would help me make sense of the chaos. One night, as I was writing, I heard a noise outside. Peering through the window, I saw Ethan standing by the garage, talking to someone. The shadows obscured their features, but I could tell it was a woman. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear their conversation. "She's starting to break," Ethan said, low and conspiratorial. "Good," the woman replied. "It needs to happen soon." I recoiled, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? What were they planning? I knew I couldn't confront Ethan directly. I needed proof. The next day, I installed a small camera in the garage, hoping to catch them in the act. I spent the evening anxiously watching the footage, but nothing happened. It wasn't until the following night that I finally got my answer. Ethan and the woman stood close, their faces illuminated by the dim light. "Claire's getting suspicious," Ethan said, his tone urgent. "Then we need to accelerate the plan," the woman replied. "She can't know about the money." "Money? What money?" My mind raced. piecing together the fragments of their conversation. Ethan had always been secretive about our finances, but I had never suspected anything like this. The next morning, I took a day off work and went to the bank, requesting a detailed statement of our accounts. What I found left me reeling. Large sums of money had been transferred to an unknown account, and the transactions were all recent. I confronted Ethan that evening, unable to contain my anger any longer. "What is this?" I demanded, shoving the bank statement in his face. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw a flash of fear. "You shouldn't have done that, Claire." Before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking the wind out of me as we crashed to the floor. "You should have just stayed quiet," he hissed, his hands tightening around my throat. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I fought back with everything I had, clawing at his face, kicking, biting. I managed to break free, scrambling to my feet and grabbing the nearest object, a heavy lamp. I swung it with all my strength, connecting with his head. Ethan crumpled to the ground unconscious. I stood there, panting, staring at his motionless body. What had I done? Panic surged through me as I grabbed Lily and fled the house, driving aimlessly until I found myself at a police station. The officers listened patiently as I recounted everything: the abuse, the secret meetings, the stolen money. They assured me I had done the right thing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. What if Ethan woke up? What if he came after us? Days turned into weeks, and I struggled to rebuild my life. The police arrested Ethan, and he was charged with fraud and assault. The woman, his accomplice, turned out to be a former lover, and together they had been siphoning money from our accounts, planning to disappear and leave me with nothing. But the damage was done. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow sent me into a panic. I had survived, but at what cost? One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a familiar noise outside. My heart raced as I crept to the window, peering into the darkness. There, standing by the garage, was Ethan. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and smiled. "You should have stayed quiet, Claire." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How could this be? He was in jail. I had seen him taken away. But as I turned to run, I felt his hand on my shoulder, his breath hot on my neck. "You can never escape me," he whispered. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. It had been a dream, a nightmare. But as I lay there, trembling, I realized the truth. Ethan might be gone, but he would haunt me forever, a specter of the life I had once known. The darkness he brought into my world would never truly leave. And in the silence of the night, I could still hear his voice echoing in my mind. "You should have stayed quiet." And I knew, deep down, that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the nightmare would always be just one step behind me.
I promised my 8-year-old daughter Stella a toy if she behaved at her doctor's appointment. She has a history of throwing fits at the doctor, so I was trying to avoid a tantrum. It worked. Stella was a little angel for the doctor. She didn't even cry when she received her vaccines. Following the appointment, we headed to Target to get her toy and a few other things we needed. She was a jumping bean of excitement, so we went to the toy section first. I gave her a $15 budget and told her to pick whatever she wanted while praising her good behavior. Stella scanned the shelves carefully, not wanting to squander this opportunity until she found a brown animatronic pirate bear. It was a fluffy bear dressed as a pirate with an eye patch and a hook for a hand. Just looking into its one good pitch black eye gave me the creeps. "Are you sure you want this one, honey?" I asked her. Maybe we should increase the budget to $20 and then you can get a new Barbie." Stella insisted on the bear. My husband, her father, had just watched Pirates of the Caribbean with her, so she was on a big pirate kick. Although I wanted to pick something else, I didn't fight her. We threw the pirate bear into the cart and headed to the cleaning supplies. Stella wanted to hold the bear as we walked through Target, so I let her. She kept pressing the button to see everything the bear could say. It first said, "Can you keep a secret?" and something else about the Pirate Code of Honor. Knowing a little bit about pirate history, I thought the idea they had a code of honor was a little funny. It was just a toy though. It didn't need to be historically accurate. When we got home, her dad helped her remove the bear from the package. It came with a controller so she could control its movements. It was a pretty nifty thing for only $13. The bear quickly became Stella's favorite toy. She named it Mr. Fizzles. We would hear Stella and Mr. Fizzles having entire conversations. She wanted to bring it everywhere, even to school, but we told her Mr. Fizzles had to stay at home. We let her take it on a play date, and that is where the troubles began. I dropped her off at a friend's, and when I came to pick her up, her friend's mom, Becky, said she needed to talk to me. She seemed concerned. Becky explained she had walked in on Stella and her friend wrestling. At first, I laughed it off as odd, but kids want to try new things, so nothing too out of the ordinary was there. Becky continued. She said it didn't appear to be play wrestling. She walked into the room with Stella holding her daughter in a chokehold, tapping Stella's arm to release her. The mom told Stella to release her daughter, and Stella listened. Becky said, "If I didn't walk in when I did, I don't know if Stella would have let my daughter go. I'm scared, which is why I'm telling you I'm concerned." She then asked the girls for an explanation of what happened. Becky said Stella was visibly annoyed and frustrated that her daughter was so forthcoming with information. According to her daughter, Mr. Fizzle suggested a new game for them to try, but they had to promise to keep it a secret. At one point, Stella snapped at her friend, saying something about the pirate code, and her friend said, "It's a toy, it's not real." I agreed with the mom that it was weird and concerning. Stella had never been so aggressive before. I apologized for Stella's behavior and promised to talk to her about the incident and whatever happened with Mr. Fizzles. When Stella came out of the house, I could tell she had been crying. I wondered if she was embarrassed, but after talking to her in the car, it was apparently something Mr. Fizzles said. Stella said he scolded her for breaking the pirate code. I assumed she was just playing make-believe, and maybe it started feeling a little too real for her. I asked her about the wrestling incident, and Stella refused to talk about it. "Honey, Miss Jones said that you were your friend. Can we talk about it?" Stella responded, "I don't know what she's talking about." "I know you're lying to me. Miss Jones told me about it. I want to give you a chance to tell your side before Daddy and I discuss the consequences. It's not okay to do that to someone. She could have been seriously hurt." "I said I don't know what she's talking about," Stella said angrily. She brought Mr. Fizzles to her chest in a hug. The rest of the ride home was quiet. Her dad and I talked about it, and neither of us knew what to do. Stella had never been violent before. She never had an interest in combat, of all things. Maybe the pirate stuff is driving her nuts. They were known to be brutal, I suggested to my husband. Let's take Mr. Fizzles for a couple of days, and maybe the pirate obsession will wear off some. I also don't love that the toy is encouraging her to keep secrets. That's the part that's really upsetting me. Stella refused to tell me what happened, and I think it's because one of the things Mr. Fizzles says is, "Can you keep a secret?" My husband agreed that it was a good idea. The next morning at breakfast, we explained to Stella that we would hold on to Mr. Fizzles for a couple of days. We expected a strong reaction, but it was nowhere near as intense as Stella's. She threw her plate across the room at the news and started crying. "You'll get him back in a couple of days. We just think you two need some space." "No!" Stella screamed. She ran to her room and slammed the door. We looked at each other and agreed to give her some time to calm down before taking Mr. Fizzles. After about 30 minutes, I approached her room to confiscate the bear. When I was about to open the door, I could have sworn I heard Mr. Fizzles say, "It'll be okay, Stella." I assumed I was just hearing things. I lightly knocked on her door and she opened it. I asked for Mr. Fizzles, and she handed him to me. I thanked her for complying. I walked to my closet and put Mr. Fizzles on the top shelf where Stella couldn't reach him. As I started to exit, I thought I heard Mr. Fizzles say, "Big mistake." I turned around and looked at the bear. Its one black eye stared back at me. I picked it off the shelf and pressed the button on its hand, which caused it to speak. Arrgh! Assuming again I was hearing things, I put the bear back. I almost thought I heard the bear laughing as I closed the closet door. I talked to my husband about it, and he suggested that maybe I was just upset and stressed by Stella's acting out. That made sense, so I tried to not think about it. That night, we were awakened by Stella standing at the foot of our bed, her eyes wide with pure anger. "Stella, baby," my husband said, "what are you doing?" Stella could barely respond because she was crying so hard. She sniffled out, "I'm here for Mr. Fizzles." My husband and I looked at each other. He then got up and took her back to her room. While he talked to her, I couldn't help but cry. What was happening to my once peaceful daughter? Where was all this coming from? I was beginning to grow scared she may need therapy. My husband returned and brought out Mr. Fizzles. He looked at the bear closely under the light. "Oh God," he exclaimed. Before I could ask what was going on, he turned the bear over and ripped it open. He stripped the toy until all we were left with was the robot. He looked at me and could tell I was confused and horrified. "I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist," he said, "but I wonder if someone has been controlling Mr. Fizzles and talking to our daughter through him. If you look at his eye in the light, you can see it's a camera." I wanted to vomit. "I'll take it apart and see if I can figure it out. That eye is definitely a camera, though." My husband is a software engineer with a robotics hobby, so I nodded and let him do his thing. He stayed up all night tinkering with Mr. Fizzles. The next morning, my husband stopped me before going down for breakfast. "I think we need to talk to the authorities about this. I found a transmission so someone, God knows where, could control its movements. They could even talk through the bear. I'll go to the police station later today to tell them what I found." "So Stella isn't crazy?" I asked. "No, but it looks like she's been talking to someone. Some creep has been talking to her, and that's where the aggressive behavior came from." I grabbed my heart. "Oh my," I said. "We'll tell her Mr. Fizzles left because his friends called him. From some of the things she said, I'm confident she'll buy it." He was right. Stella was sad about her friend departing, but she said something like he had a lot of responsibilities, so she understood. The police said they couldn't trace the transmission to anything, so there wasn't anything they could do. They suggested reaching out to the toy company to alert them. We were unsure if we just got a bad bear or if it was all the pirate bears, so we emailed the company, doubting we'd hear back. And we never did. It all started when Jack was explaining his mom's favorite movie. It starred Natalie Portman. She acted as a pregnant lady who lived in a Walmart. The boys and I were playing video games, talking about it over our headsets. They all chirped about how unrealistic it was that someone could get away with living in any store. "I totally think we could do it," Jack said. Our friends strongly disagreed. They insisted that they had 24-hour surveillance and that the cops would come right when we crawled out of our hiding spot. My interest was piqued. I told them, "No, I agree with Jack. I think we could do it. They probably don't have someone watching the cameras overnight, and I doubt anyone will check the footage." I worked in a grocery store, so I figured Walmart and a grocery store would have some similar practices. The boys howled in disagreement. They dared us to try. If we succeeded and stayed overnight at a Walmart, they would pay us each $100. Honestly, I thought it was going to be chump change. The next day, Jack and I got to work. We started by watching the Natalie Portman movie to see what she did. Even if it is fiction, we thought we could still learn a thing or two. Then we scoped out our local Walmart for hiding spots. They didn't have a tent like the one Natalie hid in, but we discovered we could fit in the wardrobes in the furniture section. Jack is short and thin, so like an acrobat, he fit himself into one of the larger dressers. Maybe we should have done more inspecting, but we felt like those hiding spots were foolproof. We updated our friends, and they all laughed that we were actually going to go through with it. For $100? In this economy? Absolutely, I responded. One of our friends said we could tell our parents we were sleeping over at his place. We waited until about 10 p.m. to go into the store because it closed at 11. We walked around with a cart, acting like we were shopping. At 10:45, we abandoned the cart and tucked ourselves away in the furniture. Through the crack of the wardrobe, I saw a worker take our discarded cart. I held my breath, scared I would be found out, but the worker paid me no mind. They grabbed the cart and continued without a second thought. Relief washed over me. We heard them switch off the big lights at about 11:40. We waited a while more before crawling out to ensure the coast was clear. We stretched our legs and looked at each other. Jack said, "So what do we do now?" One thing we hadn't planned for was how dull it would be. Sitting around looking at our phones felt like a waste, so we started to explore. We roamed the aisles and were honestly bored out of our minds. "Let's go to the back rooms," I suggested. When I first started working at the grocery store, I thought it was so cool to go through the swinging doors to the area that was forbidden to customers. That was a small grocery store, and this was a massive Walmart. Jack loved the idea. We made our way to the back of the store when we heard what sounded like a door shut. Our heads snapped in different directions, and we looked for the source of the noise. "Did you hear that?" Jack whispered. I nodded. Maybe it was an air duct or something. That idea put us at ease, so we continued. We pushed through the swinging doors to the back. Jack had a big grin on his face. Now we were having fun. It was so dark in the back that we debated turning on a light, but we thought it was too risky. We used our phones to light our way. Sure enough, the back was massive, much bigger than the grocery store. Instead of plastic walls, it was concrete. There were 3 rows of large silver shelves and piles of boxes in the corners. As we weaved through the forbidden aisles, we heard a steady scraping sound. We froze and looked at each other. I put my index finger to my lips to signal him to remain quiet. I was trying to tell where the sound was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from one of the other aisles. "I have no idea what that could be," I whispered to Jack. "Let's, maybe get out of here." "Yeah, that sounds good to me." Jack followed close behind me as the scraping sound continued. Right as we reached the swinging doors, Jack spoke up. "May?" I looked behind me to see why Jack suddenly stopped talking, but he was no longer behind me. "Jack," I whispered. "Jack, this isn't funny. Come out." I realized the scraping sound stopped. I listened for footsteps, breaths, anything that could reveal where Jack disappeared to, but I heard nothing. "Brian!" Jack yelled from somewhere in the back. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, and I had no idea where it was coming from. "Jack!" I yelled back. "Where are you?" Jack yelled my name again, but this time it was shriller and more urgent. I found the light switch and flipped on the lights. Now I could see, but I still couldn't see him. "I'm coming, Jack!" I yelled back. No response, but I thought I heard a low chuckle. I weaved through the aisles looking for him when I saw something and my stomach dropped. "Jack," I said as I slowly approached him. Around the corner, I found Jack on the ground, barely breathing. There was a huge gash on his stomach. Jack reached for me. He started talking, but he was strained. There's a man," he said weakly. His eyes widened, and he began pointing at something behind. I turned around and saw a man dragging an axe. He reminded me of Freddy Krueger, but he didn't have scars or knives for hands. But he did have a devilish grin on his face. "Who are you?" he asked slowly. I hesitated. Brian?" "Brian." His smile grew wider. He lifted his axe and began to swing, but I dodged it when it came down. I stood up and looked at Jack. He motioned for me to go. I couldn't leave him behind. I hoisted him up by taking one of his arms around my shoulder. The man prepared to swing again, but Jack and I shuffled away. "Why isn't he running after us?" I asked Jack. He was in too much pain to respond. We headed towards the swinging doors. I could hear him dragging his axe behind us. I tried to move faster, but I could only move so fast with Jack injured. I headed towards the aisle with the bandages and rubbing alcohol so we could bandage Jack up until he could get some real medical help. I listened for the axe, but I could no longer hear it. It probably didn't make as much noise on the softer floors. We made it to the bandages, and I started to put pressure on his gash. I didn't really know what to do, but in the movies they always say, "Put pressure on it!" So I went with that. "O'Brien," I heard the Axeman sing. My heart stopped. He sounded close. Right as he was about to turn the corner, a couple of cops and a Walmart manager came walking down the aisle. It was like the Axeman evaporated at the sight of them. He disappeared into the shadows. If it weren't for the Axeman, I would have been furious at my friends for ratting us out to the police. Thankfully, they saved our lives because they couldn't afford to give us each $100. Jack survived. He needed a lot of stitches and a blood transfusion, but the cops found us just in time. We explained what happened, and they searched that Walmart from top to bottom, looking for that man, but they didn't find anyone. We gave them a character description, and the cops said they would contact us if they learned anything. They never did. The case went unsolved, but Jack and I survived. Later in life, I learned that I couldn't shop at Walmart because it triggered me. So, I only shop at Target now. Rain lashed at the car's windshield, creating a thick veil of mist across the screen. Even with the windscreen wipers on full, it barely cleared one sheet of rain before another took its place, obscuring the road ahead. It was late, sometime after midnight, and the roads were empty. I had stayed behind at work to get some documents finished before the weekend, and time had completely slipped away from me. I was tired and desperate to get home, but I still had another 30 minutes to drive, and the rain didn't seem to be letting up. If anything, it was getting heavier, thudding against the roof of the car like tiny missiles. I couldn't keep driving in this. It was too dangerous. I kept going for another 5 minutes before the tires finally skidded on the slick road, and I decided it wasn't safe to keep going. I was on a backcountry road and nothing but trees surrounded me for miles, until I saw a sign up ahead for an off-road motel. I didn't plan on sticking around for long, just until the rain let up, but maybe they'd let me stay inside and grab a hot drink for a while. If not, at least there'd be somewhere to park my car for a bit. The car plugged along for the last mile until the motel came into sight, a little ways back from the main road. It was an old-fashioned looking building, gray and washed out beneath the stormy dusk. There were only a couple of other cars parked up, so I clumsily pulled into one of the spaces and killed the engine. Sitting in silence, I listened to the pounding echo of the rain on the windows and bonnet. It was really coming down out there. Part of me didn't want to get out of the car, but I didn't want to be sitting out here in the dark either. I'd parked fairly close to the reception building, so I just had to run a short distance and I'd be warm and sheltered. Most places like this had a vending machine for hot drinks too, so maybe I'd be lucky enough to get a decent cup of coffee to keep me awake. I waited for a brief lull in the downpour before throwing open my car door and pelting across the parking lot towards the reception building. It didn't take long for the rain to soak through my clothes, and I wondered if I'd been better off just staying in the car, but it was too late to regret it now. I wrung the water out of my clothes and pushed through the door to the motel's reception. Inside was as old and grimy looking as the exterior, and I was disappointed to see no vending machine in sight. Maybe I'd been wrong about stopping. I should have just kept driving. A reception desk and a couple of tatty-looking chairs were the only furniture filling the small area. The lights were faulty, flickering at the edges of my vision, and there was nobody at the desk. The place might have seemed abandoned if not for the 2 cars outside. There had to be someone here. With a sigh, I turned around, intending to run back to my car when a voice spoke behind me. "Can I help you?" I gave a start, my heart lurching into my throat. I turned around to see a tall, gangly-looking man standing at the reception desk. Had he been there before? Surely there was no way I would have missed seeing someone like him. He had greasy black hair and dark, hooded eyes that watched me with a strange gleam. "Oh, sorry to bother you," I said, clearing my throat. I was just looking for somewhere to get out of the rain. Maybe, get a hot drink?" The man studied me carefully across the room. He wore a white button shirt that was stained around the collar, and a pair of black pants that looked a size too big for him. Everything about him screamed scruffy, but it was his eyes that bothered me the most. Dark and deep-set, watching me like a predator. "I can offer you a room," he said, his voice low, crackly like static. No, that's okay," I said quickly. "Maybe I could just stay here until the rain slows down." As soon as I said those words, I regretted it. Did I really want to stay here? In this grimy old motel with this strange man looking at me like that? Even as a man, he was giving me the serious creeps. The man inclined his head slowly. He said, and I realized he was agreeing to let me stay. Thanks," I said, walking over to one of the chairs and sitting down. Outside, a peal of thunder cracked across the sky like a whip, making me jump. Thunder didn't usually scare me, but maybe I was more on edge than usual. I could still feel the man watching me across the room, making me shuffle uncomfortably. "So, you get much business out here?" I asked, trying to break the silence and maybe make him do something other than just stare. "Enough," he answered shortly. I shifted my feet. Overhead, the lights flickered off and on again, sending shadows scuttling across the room. When I looked up, the man had moved closer, stepping out from behind the reception desk. I swallowed thickly. Now that he was closer, I could smell something on him. Sweat, maybe, or grime? But also something else, something sharp and metallic. I flicked a glance towards him, and my gaze snagged something on his shirt. Something dark splashed on the white material. I felt my stomach twinge, but forced myself to think rationally. So what if he had some blood on his shirt? Maybe he cut himself or had a nosebleed. It wasn't that strange. So why is he creeping closer like that? Another voice whispered in the back of my head. And looking at you like that. I cleared my throat again. Sweat dribbled down the back of my neck. I stood up suddenly, which seemed to startle the man. He quickly recovered, looking at me curiously. He was much closer than before, almost close enough to touch me. "You know, I think the rain seems to be slowing down," I said, marching towards the door. I reached for the handle and gasped when it wouldn't open. No matter how much I tugged on the door, it wouldn't budge. How was it locked? I hadn't seen the man go anywhere near the door to lock it. "What seems to be the matter?" the man asked from behind me, smugness dripping from his voice. "Have you decided to stay after all?" "What the hell? Oh, open the door!" I snarled, turning around to face him again. The man shrugged. "You know, it's dangerous driving in a storm. You really should stay." I shook my head and turned back to the door, frantically tugging at the handle and slamming my fists on the glass. But of course, nobody was out there to help me. And even if there was, nobody would hear me over the sound of the pouring rain. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs as the man approached. He moved with a predatory grace, each step silent despite the drumming of the rain on the roof. Each second stretched into an eternity. The heavy air thick with the metallic tang of fear and something else I couldn't place. Just as he reached me, a deafening crack of thunder split the sky, plunging the room into darkness. In the momentary blackout, a sharp object pressed against my neck, sending a jolt of terror through me. "Don't move," a low voice rasped in my ear, sending shivers down my spine. "This won't hurt if you cooperate." He guided me towards a single lit candle on the desk, its flickering flame casting grotesque shadows against the wall. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the door remained stubbornly locked. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the storm's fury. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "A little company." He leaned closer, the warmth of his breath tickling my ear, his hand rough and calloused brushing against me. To my surprise, it wasn't a violent gesture, but a hesitant touch, almost questioning. Under the flickering candlelight, I saw his eyes properly for the first time. They weren't cold and calculating as I had initially thought, but filled with a deep sadness and a hint of fear. The thought sparked a flicker of something within me, a strange mix of fear and morbid curiosity. As the storm raged outside, the room inside became a scene of a bizarre dance. He, the predator, hesitant and unsure, and me, the prey, fighting a primal urge to submit to the raw, animalistic tension in the air. Our eyes locked, and in that moment I understood. He wasn't the monster I'd envisioned. He was a man, a broken one, seeking solace in the storm's chaos just like me. The line between predator and prey blurred. As the candle flickered and died, plunging us into darkness, I met his touch halfway, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but in the quiet darkness of the motel room, a different kind of storm brewed. A storm of desperate need and unexpected connection. It was a storm of survival, forged in the crucible of fear, with an ending as unpredictable as the weather that had brought us together. My name is Tanya, and I'm an elementary school teacher. For the last year, I've worked at a pretty dysfunctional charter school. It was run by a woman named Janice. She started the school just before the pandemic, and most of the staff were her family members. I was the only non-relative working for her, and she treated me like garbage. Because all the other teachers were in her family, they did whatever she wanted. But because I'd been a public school teacher for most of my adult life, I knew that a lot of her decisions were just wrong. I pushed back against her a lot, but always because I wanted the best for our students. When Janice announced a school field trip to Grapevine Canyon, I was surprised that she chose me as one of the chaperones. I agreed to go, of course. I love taking students on field trips, especially if they got to see nature. The bus arrived at the canyon, and I was in charge of half the students while Janice was in charge of the rest. Most of the students in her group were related to her. It was a really fun trip. We got to see some ancient Native American petroglyphs, plus some really cool rock formations. The kids seemed to really enjoy it. As we made it back to the bus, Janice's students all came up to me. "Miss Tanya," one of them said, "we can't find Miss Janice." It was Parker, one of Janice's nephews, and he sounded really nervous. I told all of the kids to wait on the bus while I went back into the canyon to look for her. I was very annoyed. Janice had broken the one rule of field trips. She'd left her students behind and gotten lost. I looked everywhere for her, but I couldn't find her. I headed back to the bus, hoping that she'd found her way back, but the bus was gone. They'd left without me. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but I didn't have any reception. In a situation like this, I knew the best thing to do was stay put and wait for the bus to come back. It didn't. I was so angry, but I was starting to get nervous too. Eventually, I saw a white van drive toward me. A man was in the driver's seat. I'd never seen him before. He parked in front of me and asked what I was doing here alone. I explained that my school had left me here, and he scolded me for wandering off by myself. I wasn't in the mood for a lecture, especially because this was Janice's fault, not mine. So I just stood there and listened to him go off. But as he was talking, I noticed that his tone of voice sounded a lot like Janice's. When I looked into his steely blue eyes, I noticed that they looked a lot like Janice's eyes. I wasn't certain, but I had a strong feeling that he was one of Janice's relatives too. When he was done lecturing me, he told me to hop in so he could drive me back to town. I didn't trust him, so I asked one question. "Where are you from?" He looked at me, confused, and said, "New Jersey, why?" Janice was from New Jersey. That was all the proof I needed. This guy was definitely her relative, which meant that there was something fishy going on. As a teacher, I always came prepared. Because we were out in the wild, I brought pepper spray with me. I got close to his open window and sprayed him right in the face. He screamed out in pain, distracting him long enough for me to reach in and pull his keys out of the ignition. I demanded to know what was going on. He wouldn't answer, so I sprayed him again. As he desperately wiped his face, he told me that he was Janice's brother. Their whole family wanted to get rid of me, so he was going to take me somewhere deep in the desert, kill me, and then hide my body so that everyone thought I'd gotten lost in the canyon. At least that's what I think he said. He was really struggling to talk through all the pain. I opened the door, pulled him out of the van, and shoved him onto the gravel. Then I hopped in, stuck in the keys, and drove off. When I got back into town, I drove straight to the police station. I saw the school bus parked outside. All the kids were gone, but the driver was still there. He was Janice's cousin. I snuck past, making sure he didn't see me, and then I walked into the waiting room. All the students were sitting in the lobby. When they saw me, they jumped out of their seats and gave me a big group hug. I asked what was going on, and they said that Miss Janice was talking to the police about my disappearance. They pointed toward a door behind them. I told the kids to sit back down and stay quiet. Because I'm a good teacher, they did what I said. I reached the door, which was open just a crack. I could hear the conversation inside. Janice was telling the police how I had left my students behind to wander around the canyon, and I'd disappeared. Parker, Janice's little nephew, was there too. He agreed with her story. She'd obviously told him what to say. The policeman said he'd sent out his men to start searching for me. That's when I pushed open the door and walked inside. "No need," I told the policeman. "I'm safe, but you might need to send someone down there to help Janice's brother. He tried to kidnap me, so I pepper sprayed him and left him there." Janice and Parker stared at me, horrified. The charter school closed down after that, and I went back to teaching at a public school. Public schools have a lot of problems too, but nothing compares to my time at that charter school. Janice and most of her family are in jail now. It's what they deserve.
I tried to ignore the lady in the yellow dress and flat-soled shoes as I shopped, but there was something unsettling about a stranger staring at you in a Target while you're shopping for groceries. I changed aisles, stared away from her on purpose so that we would have no reason to interact, as I felt too much expiration in me from long hours of working at night to interact with anyone at Target. But her staring was persistent, following me everywhere I went, until I was forced to confront her. I drifted to her as stealthily as I could, careful not to disturb the other shoppers, but realizing I would have to be loud if I was suddenly in any form of danger. When we were closer, I perceived a strangely familiar smell from her, which sent my brain into this familiar sense of remembrance. My brows fell into the middle, and my scowl eased when I saw that this stranger smiled at me. "Excuse me, miss, do I know you?" I asked in hushed tones, just around the aisle from the toilets. I was not aware of the large Target signpost just above my head, so I moved from underneath it as she spoke. "Do you?" she asked in return with a casual shrug. Her eyes were bright, almost in humor, and this confused me, as I was sure I didn't have any relationships with this stranger before. A prank. A bitter pool flooded my mouth as I looked over my shoulder to search for any hidden camera that could be used to be set up to capture my reaction to amused audiences. I found nothing. "You seriously do not remember me, Emily?" she said, and my heart sank when I saw that her face was no longer with a grin, but with the look of dejection. She knew my name. I was curious now. She squared up, and her smile started to creep back with a hint of knowing. My obliviousness made me uncomfortable. She put me out of my torture with one word, and it dropped me into terror. "Barbara." The words rolled off her lips. Suddenly, all at once, old memories flickered. Forgotten thoughts that I had long been detached from as I grew older started back into my mind. I stuttered an incoherent phrase. I looked around and it suddenly felt like we were alone in the aisle. The loneliness seeped into all parts of the store, and I was horrified that 23 years after college, Barbara still remembered me. I gulped with difficulty, horror causing my eyes to glaze with tears. I recalled the last time I was trapped by her into that confinement of our room in college. All that cryptic sermon about sacrifice of my life and the lingering fear that I had to battle for years after she stabbed my chest with the poking knife. Pieces of my life had fallen into better places since then, but the picture of chilling manipulation emerged with a rush. Seeing her again felt as though I had betrayed myself a second time. "Stay away from me, Barbara," I cried as I stumbled backwards. She ignored my frantic warnings and instead marched with me, ever so stoic and hypnotic, her eyebrows flattened in relaxation. I cried out for help, knowing that somewhere in a large store someone would hear me out and do something about it. But my feet failed me when I tried to run. It felt like a terrible dream that I willed myself to be awoken from. I was on the floor, incapable of bringing myself back to my feet as Barbara approached me, intrigued by her own conviction. Perhaps she saw in me the little naive girl that she manipulated into a death pack, one that she could finish her twisted fantasies on, the same that she had started over 2 decades ago. "You owe your life to me, Emily. Don't you see that you never really escaped it?" she said to me with an unsettling whisper as she grabbed an item from the rack. My eyes followed her movement, and I saw that it was a thin rope that she had picked. My dread heightened. My life flashed before my eyes, and my entire body was numb from this confrontation, which I wanted no part in. I turned over on the floor and buried my head in my hands to cast away this nightmare, wishing that I would just wake up in some different world. I sensed the futility of my wishes when Barbara's breath hit the back of my neck, the damp feeling of the rope eating into the neck of my skin. I withdrew my hands from my face, and I was suddenly aware of how soaked my eyes had become from crying. My lips parted, and I started to sob out loud, offering pleas to her for mercy. Minutes passed into a blur of anxious waiting for salvation that I no longer had hopes for. I surrendered to the terror of death when I saw its hands reach for me from the darkest recesses of my fear. My mind replayed every interaction that I had in a fast-moving reel, and it was strange to experience them all as I fully enveloped into what was happening. I gasped for air, and my ears felt as though they would explode from the rush of blood going to my head. "Please, Barbara, stop," I sobbed. She hushed me and told me that my sacrifice was necessary. She tightened the rope. I simply hoped at that point for a quick death. I was surprisingly aware of what the news might read. "Lady found strangled to death in retail store." I was going through every thought in my head when suddenly I heard the sound of something bang behind me. The rope around my neck suddenly felt loose, and I coughed up in a violent fit as I scrambled blindly away from my attacker. 2 strangers, a man and a woman, suddenly appeared in front of me. The man appeared to pin Barbara to the floor, while the woman rushed to my side with her hands held up to show me that she meant no harm. When I allowed myself to rest by her shoulder, she spoke. "Ma'am, are you okay? Ma'am," she asked me. I was so dizzy from the attack that it took me a minute to realize that they were police. I burst into tears. I looked around and I found Barbara under the weight of the man's knee, with both her hands behind her back. Barbara looked remorseful, just as she had when she made me deny that she hurt me back in college. I had gotten her off the hooks that time, but this time I would not lie to let her escape the law a second time. I knew I had to save myself from this psychopath. "She tried to kill me," I confessed. Immediately, Barbara was placed under arrest and handcuffed, taken away with my terror ended. The The rain hammered outside Walmart like the fury of 1,000 dwarves storming a fort, and my heart mimicked the beat of its thumbs as I did my work. It was work that I had done time and time again, so much so that I'm sure I could do it with my eyes closed. But there was a problem with being so bored with the tasks of filling rows with products that made me absent-minded. Once, like a sudden rallying cry to a running force, the thunder in the sky would rumble loud after the rain, and it would awaken my senses. I would quiver, look around, then fall back into my task. I had gone about halfway through my shift for the night, and in between my distraction, I had hope for some excitement. I had no idea that the forces of the world would have a way to answer my prayer so soon, but it was no more than a minute after I had said my prayer that I heard the shelf behind me creak, as if though someone leaned on it. I was startled, and as I turned around to see what the problem was, my eyes were met with that of a stranger's, with a basket in his hand. I was in my Walmart uniform, so it was not unusual that he would be comfortable with seeing me. But he did some bizarre thing that should have tickled my senses. He stopped between the shelves and glared at me like a specimen he found amusing. I watched him through the corner of my eyes, and it made me uneasy that he paused in his stance, like a mannequin. When I lifted my head from the task, he was still there, and he was staring at me with his head fixed, and only his eyes moved. He was drenched from the crown of his head to his shoes. His hair was so thin that the water slicked his tuft to his scalp. He was pale, beaten by the rain until it appeared as though he was drained of his blood, almost as white as snow. One look at him, and he had such a strong image that it took only once to be impressed by the mind. His face was defined, eyes sunken and black. The nose on his face was long, with an aristocratic aspect to his features that made him appear as though he arrogantly hung in the air. His lips were pink in contrast to the rest of his face. Hello, I stammered to break the uneasy, icy confrontation that was between us. Do you need something? Of course he needed something. I blew air through the roof of my mouth. It was why he came to the shop, but he didn't answer. He just stared until what felt like moved from being a simple concern to a streak of anxiousness. I searched deeper into his eyes, and I noticed a thin film of coating on his eyes, as one were on the brink of tears. I struggled for relief, looking for the next person to walk by the shelf that would offer help. I'm sorry, I have to leave, I said politely, when I noticed he wouldn't say anything. I strolled towards him to take his side of the aisle. It was a stupid mistake on my part, and I only realized it when he held my hands and pulled me to himself with such force that it rocked me. The maneuver to get me to rest my back on his broad chest was from someone who was very skilled at it, because I could barely resist his strong arm and the grip of it around my throat. I was suddenly desperate for escape as soon as I was in his hands, but a scalpel flashed purposely across my face, and I froze. He pressed it to the small of my back and leaned into my ears. Terror seized all my senses, and even though I was aware of my surroundings, I suffered from being unable to process any of it. His tears landed on my shoulder, and instead of sobbing, as I expected, he was cackling. I was confused as I was terrified. The horror of what this strange, quirky man would do to me made me queasy. My stomach roiled and tumbled, aching all the way to my lower stomach. Please, I beg you, let me go, I whimpered as I struggled to hold myself together while the blade that threatened to disembowel me was still on me. But he was still laughing, at least for a minute more before he spoke. She begged too, you know, my beautiful Georgina, he said, and he teased the blade up my back, snagging the sharp edges of my Walmart uniform. I did not particularly enjoy my job on most days, but on that day, I simply wished I didn't work at all. My life was in the hands of a stranger, with no one coming to help me. I gulped a hard ball of saliva, and my tears from my eyes sliced over my cheeks, and they fell into my open mouth. I can't escape it. You don't understand. I'm going to the chair. They'll kill me when they find me. He laughed as hard as he could. But before they kill me, I'll kill you just like I killed the others. The others? My mind was so slow to interpret everything that I was struggling to put the pieces of what was happening together as I sensed us being surrounded. My relief was halfway drawn when I saw the police. I realized in that moment just how much danger I was in. I was unsure at what moment I had slipped into a nightmare, but I wanted to be away from the horse so much that I began to say prayers, the same prayers that my grandmother would say. "Let her go, Rodriguez!" The burly cop with a gun in his hand leaned into the shelf on the right. The other cops made a semicircle around the edge of the shelf with their guns drawn. My prayers intensified because I was in the middle of it on. I was the pawn. My heart drummed against my chest cage, and I was dizzy by how forceful the sheer terror made me. Then he started to talk, and the more he spoke of what he'd done, bragged about how his victims begged like his beautiful Georgina had begged him before he killed her, the more hysterical he got. He got into such a mad fit that he entrapped me into his horribly twisted mind before he did the strangest thing. He poked the knife into the side of my stomach, and the pain of the scalpel puncturing my stomach shook my body. I let out a loud cry of pain, and the gunshot went off. That was all I saw before I fainted. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. I was told by officers that Rodriguez was killed. They confronted him after they got a tip that he was a serial killer.
My name is Linda. I'm a 52-year-old mother of two and a grandmother of one. I've lived a wonderful, fulfilling life. But when my husband Daniel passed away unexpectedly, I really started to struggle with money. I never had a real job before. I was always a stay-at-home mother. But without Daniel's paycheck, I needed to find something. I started working at the Target near my house. It felt weird going from the housewife who shopped there all the time to the red-coated lady behind the counter. But it wasn't a bad job. And when I saw my friends and neighbors waiting in my line, I never felt self-conscious. One night, I was the only cashier there. It was a little less than a half hour before closing. Suddenly, a customer walked in. He was a tall, bearded man covered in tattoos. I could see he had a gun in his holster at his hip. I live in Arizona, so carrying a gun is legal here, but it always makes me uncomfortable. I smiled at him, but he just walked right past me without saying anything. I waited at my counter for the rest of my shift, but he never came back. No other customers came in or out. It was just him, and I had no idea where he went. I was ready to close up for the day, but I couldn't do that if I thought he was still in the store. I nervously walked through the aisles, looking everywhere for him. I even checked inside the bathrooms, but I couldn't find him. I didn't know what else to do. I was genuinely scared. I called out, "Hello? Is anybody still here?" My voice echoed throughout the empty store. I hated that I was alone. I hated that the man had a gun. I knew for a fact that I saw him come in, but I never saw him leave. I also knew that there were no other exits besides the doors in the front, but even though I didn't have an explanation for where the man went, I had to close up. So I turned off all the lights and checked that all the registers were locked. Then I left through the front and locked the doors behind me. I tried to sleep that night, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about that man. The next day, I called my coworker who was on the morning shift and asked if anything was out of the ordinary at the store. She told me no, everything was normal. I felt relieved, even though I still had paranoid thoughts in the back of my mind. That night, I went back for another shift. Thankfully, there was another coworker with me, so I wasn't completely alone. Just before closing, I was helping one of our last customers. My coworker Lacey was somewhere in the back, and as the customer was leaving, 3 more men walked in, all with guns on their hips. They walked with the same kind of angry determination as the man before. I nervously greeted them, but just like before, they pretended I wasn't there. I watched them disappear down the aisles. A few minutes later, Lacey came back to the registers and I asked her if she'd seen anyone in the back. She said she hadn't, no one was here. I told her about the 3 men I had just seen, plus the man from yesterday, and my coworker's eyes widened. "Oh my God," she muttered. "We were supposed to close up in about 5 minutes, so we had to get to the bottom of this." Together, we walked around the empty store. I was too afraid to leave her side. We didn't find any signs of the 3 men. When we got to the meat section in the back, Lacey froze. She pointed toward the door behind the freezer. "Did you look in there?" she asked. There was a back room where we kept all the frozen meat. It was the only place I forgot to look. Lacey held my hand and together we walked toward the door. When we got close enough, I put my ear against the door, and sure enough, I could hear voices inside. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but before I could start the call, Lacey had already pushed the door open. That was a huge mistake. Inside were 6 men, the 3 I'd just seen, the man from the night before, and 2 others. They were all big and bearded, sitting around a table. All the frozen meat was still dangling around them, but I could feel that the refrigerator had been turned off. The room was warm and smelly. This was some sort of neo-Nazi group having a meeting in the back of Target. They saw us right away. The man from yesterday stood up and charged towards us. "This is a private meeting," he said. Then he shoved us both back and slammed the door in our faces. Lacey and I both ran out of the building and called 911. We were frantic. The police came very quickly and Lacey told them what we'd found. I was too scared to speak. One officer stayed with us to calm us down while several more walked into the store, guns ready. We waited for a long time. Everything was silent. Then we heard gunshots. The officer who had stayed with us told us to stay where we were. Then he walked inside too. We heard more gunshots. I think I was crying, but Lacey's expression was totally blank. She looked like she was in shock. Nothing happened for a long time, until the front door opened and one of the men ran out, bleeding from his shoulder. He raced towards us, glaring with pure hatred, and said, "This isn't over. I'll find you." Then he disappeared into the night. More police came pretty soon after. That's when we found out what happened. There was a huge gunfight inside. All the bearded men had been killed except for that one man. Along with the dead bodies left in the store, there were several homemade explosives and maps of the store with little red X's. Obviously, they had plans to blow up the Target. I quit the next day. I had no idea why those men decided to gather at my store. I didn't know what their big plan was. All I know is that at least one of them is still out there, and he knows who I am.